Hello, everyone. It's Shane Conto, your Wasteland reviewer, and welcome to the Development Hell podcast, our weekly podcast, which we're reconvening the movie club. Honestly, this is basically just the movie club. So there it is. And we are wrapping up our 2024. We've been doing this for 4 years now. This is crazy. So look at us. Exciting. And we're going to be talking about Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger's The Red Shoes from 1948. Young ballet dancer is torn between the man she loves and her pursuit to become a prima ballerina. And yeah, have you ever seen Black Swan before? Maybe we'll reference that. But we got Kevin, we got Joe, we got Jim, we got Vinnie joining me for this movie club episode. So we'll do our regular spiel. We'll tell everybody if this is our first time watching or how many times we've watched it and get general thoughts. And then we'll dive into one of the most gorgeous films you'll probably ever watch. And how the hell was this made in 1948? But Kevin, let's get started.
Yeah. So this was my first time watching this. Now I'm normally not a musical guy. So I didn't know what to expect going into this. I kind of had the expectation that this was a musical. I didn't know anything about the plot, characters, or anything. But recently I've been getting into the genre, I guess, a little bit. I finally watched Singing in the Rain for the first time very
Nice.
recently, and I thought that was a masterpiece, and I kind of thought the same thing of this one as well. I really like how the movie progresses, and it kind of goes deeper and deeper into this weird, kind of like surreal state as the plot moves forward. It starts out pretty straightforward. You know, we've got all these characters, and it's almost like a slice of life in London in the 40s or something. And you get deeper and deeper into Vicky's head and her little conflict between how she's expressing herself in art and how she's living her life, and it kind of manifests. I thought some of the musical sequences were beautiful. Some of the visuals were really cool to see, the way they had the superimposed shots and kind of mixing like a stage-like setting with these kind of trippy visual effects. I really enjoyed it.
All right. How about you, Joe?
So this would be my first time watching The Red Shoes. I found out about this movie for years and I've wanted to watch it through NPR. There was a radio station that I would listen to that had classical music and NPR news, and it played the soundtrack to The Red Shoes. And to me, I just kind of always knew I wanted to check out this film. I just never knew when the opportunity presented itself until now. Uh, but I mean, I'm in agreement with everybody here. It's a beautiful movie. Amazing that this came out in 48. The color correction on this looks fantastic. Um, if you were to tell someone that this is, Black Swan before Black Swan, they're not wrong because, you get a shade of madness in ballet, like all in the same way, and a fairy tale to top it all off. Um, if Disney ever adapted the Red Shoes, like the actual fairy tale, it probably wouldn't go over pretty well. They've adapted every other Hans Christian Andersen story. Probably will never want to touch this one. Um, and I guess what I also really appreciate about this film is the fact that it's kind of like what Kevin mentioned before, is that this starts off pretty standard, show business. The producer, I forget his name, proposes to the composer that he wants to, have him join his troupe, and then eventually he finds out about the actress, and then they have a relationship, and he's of course kind of jealous about that, and then that's when reality and fiction starts to blend. Really good use of practical effects for the time, especially like the stop motion effects were pretty neat. Like you have to remember, camera technology isn't like the way it is today. You had to use film. So if you stop something, you have to be in the same moment or not, change it in a certain way. And it was so seamless, right? Like it's pretty impressive. I mean, that's all I got to say. With that, I'll pass.
And Jim.
First time watching The Red Shoes. Um, I want to say I was aware of the story as a kid, but it doesn't sound familiar to me. I read the Hans Christian Andersen version today. Um, Agree, Joe. I don't, unless they, well, they always clean up the fairy tales, Disney does. So they'd find a way to adapt it, I'm sure. But like many Grimm's fairy tales, it's not, uh, it's weird. It's really weird. And I'm not sure I have a grasp on the moral of the story yet. Um, I while I was watching the movie, I wanted to be like, okay, well, this character's obsessed with this, and this character's obsessed with that, and it's just not that simple. So this is going to be one of those discussions that I'm listening to you guys more than anything else. I think it'll open my eyes a little bit. Agree, Technicolor always looks cool. It started to get interesting to me when there's one scene, they're performing live on the stage, and then they just keep panning right and panning right and panning right, and you're like, oh, where's the end of the stage? Like, I'm not sure how they did that. That was really cool. I liked a couple of the foreshadowing choices. I found myself really frustrated by the female lead and how she like just didn't or couldn't, debatably, we can talk about that, take agency over like anything that was going on. In that respect, it reminded me of watching the remake of the Phantom of the Opera from 2010, oh, something.
2004.
04,
That was
yeah,
four.
Joel
Okay, so
Schumacher.
but similar experience for me watching this female lead in a weird love triangle. Um, and she's like pulled this way and pulled that way. And I'm a little muddy about what exactly the moral of the story is supposed to be. Because we do really have three leads. It's not just about the dancer. So like,
Mm.
I don't know. There's a lot to talk about, and I guess there's three different um, ways we could come at the arcs of the story. Vinny?
So I really liked this movie. The reason why I wanted to watch it was because I saw it in several interviews with Martin Scorsese about how about how this was like one of the most influential movies in his career, and like how much like how much he used what he saw through that movie to like to shape the kind of movies that he made. Um, I really liked the three main performances. I was very drawn into the whole thing with you have the one guy, who's romantically in love with her, but but says he can also like give her like great opportunities to be a dancer, whereas you see the one guy who who isn't, he's not in love with her, but like you can kind of see like he sees more potential, he sees more potential in her than the other guy does, because he's not blinded by his feelings for her. Like he just simply tells her, you could be like one of the greatest dancers, and if you stick with my company, big things are going to happen to you. um Obviously the cinematography was a standout. When was the color correction for this? Does anybody know?
I
All
know it was
like
restored.
Because because I know them, because I was wondering, like, the original Suspiria came out 30 years later, so I was wondering if the color correction for this movie was before Suspiria. I was wondering if maybe the use of color in Suspiria was somehow influenced by the Red Shoes, because in both movies you have these instances where the colors really pop off the screen, and I don't know, I was just wondering if Dario Argento was somehow influenced, visual wise through the Red Shoes. But yeah, obviously, Suspiria, and then like you guys said, you could definitely pair this movie with Black Swan in terms of like in terms of like how people suffer through their art, and how movie view how both movies view ballet. And yeah, we'll get into more stuff, but I really liked the Red Shoes, and I'm glad I finally got to watch it.
Just to hit on something real quick. So, like, I know this has been remastered, obviously, because it's been released on like 4K and Blu-ray and stuff like that. I don't know about color correction because, like, this has been like famously, um, Powell Pressburger's films have looked this incredibly colorful and rich because, like, they were known for having films that were just absolutely striking and did not look like they were made at this specific time in history. But
Because I thought I heard someone mention color correction before. That's why I was asking.
I meant cinematography. When I say color correction, that's kind of like a term we use in like digital. I guess I meant to say cinematography, so I must have
yeah,
misspoken.
but no, it's so just to give a little bit of background. So this is the third time that I've watched this within the past year because I originally watched this for one of my other podcasts, and then I watched it again for another one of my podcasts. And this has quickly become one of my favorite films. I remember back in, I think it was 2018, watched Powell Pressburger's Black Narcissus on a car ride. So like I'm sitting there with my I think it was Filmstruck at the time because I think that was still active before it turned into Criterion Channel. And I'm like watching this on my phone and I was so blown away by how amazing this movie looked on my phone that it's been in my like top 30 favorite movies since then. And I was just fascinated. I'm like, why have I never heard of this movie before? And then over the past couple of years, I've started to hear more about Powell and Pressburger. And if anybody gets a chance to check this out, it's called Made in England, and it's a whole entire documentary about Powell and Pressburger's filmography. And it's basically a video essay with Martin Scorsese. So basically, it's like Grandpa Scorsese time, and he just takes you through all of their films. And he actually became friends with Michael Powell, and Michael Powell married Thelma Schumacher, who is like the editor for Scorsese. So like they became extremely close. Um, and I never understood why they weren't in the conversation about like all-time great filmmakers from this era. And I feel like it's their films really flew under the radar. They made films out of the UK. And this particular film really shows what they became really known for, and which Scorsese talked about a lot in this documentary is pure cinema. Because the idea of filmmaking is a visual medium, first and foremost. And if you can tell a story without any dialogue, that's something really impressive. And the whole entire climax of Black Narcissus does this. And then the ballet at the middle of this movie, because the first time I watched this film, I was a little let down by everything around the ballet because the ballet was just like this epic, amazing thing, one of the most amazing things I've ever seen on film. And then I'm like, but how could the rest of this match up to it? But each time that I've watched this film, I've been drawn in and drawn in by this quote unquote love triangle. And what's so unique about this love triangle, it's not about three people being in love. It's about you have uh Victoria Page, who's played by Moira Shearer, who's an actual ballerina. So like they got an actual dancer, which is why like she's so damn good in this doing like the dancing part. But she's stuck between a man who loves her and a man who wants to leverage her talents and push her towards her profession and not letting love get in the way. So really she's stuck between her work and her love. And I find this a very unique way of adapting a fairy tale because obviously they have the ballet of the red shoes within the film, but then the red shoes themselves become so powerful in terms of making her obsessive and not being able to give up the dance. And it all climaxes into a very heartbreaking finale of this film. And this is just one of the most visually striking and beautiful films that you're ever going to watch. And legitimately, that ballet sequence is one of the coolest things that you'll probably ever watch in a movie. It made me actually want to go watch a ballet, like for real though. Because, like, have any of you ever been to like a legitimate ballet?
100%. I actually want to add to that and say that
Oh, there you go.
ballet, ballet to me is pure art in motion. And yet for some reason I always push it to the side because of like the image that people have when they think of ballet. But like when you actually go and see something like, Swan Lake or even like the Nutcracker, whenever you get a chance, that stuff is gorgeous. It really is. Whenever there's ballet in cinema or movies, I'm the sucker for it.
I
I would
think, sorry, Vinny, you go ahead first.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say those two ballets that Joe just mentioned specifically are the only ones that I think I've seen, the Nutcracker and Swan Lake. Um, I would go back to see the Nutcracker anytime. It's like a perennial favorite, I guess, is what I'm looking for. And the episode of Peaky Blinders in which they do Swan Lake, I've always thought was the most visually beautiful episode of that show.
Peaky
Most of my
effing
ballet
blinders.
experience, though, is from my little sister's recitals growing up. I went
Mhm.
to many, many of those. But yeah, as far as I think actual ballet, that's it for me. Nutcracker and Swan Lake.
What I really liked about the ballet sequence was that like when we were watching when you first start watching it, I thought I thought like we as viewers were going to watch it from like the audience perspective, but then when it started doing all these little tricks with like the editing and the cinematography, and like you slowly begin to realize that you're watching the ballet through the mind of the main character, and what she perceives as the story that she's performing. I thought that was just a really cool trick that Powell and Pressburger pulled, and it reminded me of like the final Swan Lake sequence in Black Swan when Natalie Portman finally becomes the Black Swan, and she's doing the twirls on the stage, and she slowly starts to grow black feathers. And then and in that scene, you obviously know that's not what the audience is seeing, but it's what she's perceiving for herself.
Yeah, I thought the editing was really great, especially in that scene. Um, and that's where I really started to notice how they were changing the framing they were using for those ballet sequences. There was a shift from the beginning of the movie in that sequence where we start to get a lot more close-ups and a lot of the cuts start to get a lot quicker. And it was really well paced.
It's so influential too because, like, Vinny, obviously you brought up the finale of Black Swan. It's also the finale of La La Land. And that whole entire, like, aside where you see the two of them like dancing through their what could have been relationship and stuff like that is like that's this. An American Paris had a whole entire sequence. Scorsese said multiple times throughout that, like, all the boxing sequences in Raging Bull are supposed to be dances. And it's all based off of like the movement and everything that he saw in the red shoes. There's just so it's crazy to think that, like, this is a film that not a lot of people have watched, but plenty of people have watched films of those filmmakers who absolutely love this film and have drawn so much influence from it. And if you just put on that sequence of this film, it would probably be one of the greatest short films ever created. Because, like, you don't need any context really. It's just like you understand it's like it visually tells you the whole entire fairy tale in terms of like her getting up to the point where it's like the whole entire idea is that the shoes will make you dance until you die, which is dark, which is probably also why Disney hasn't tried to get that one and put that into film because all those little kids would love to watch their fairy princess die into the movie, dancing herself to death. No, just
Well,
all the adults
you got to
watching the red
remember
shoe
that.
instead.
Sorry to cut you off there. You got to remember that the Little Mermaid turned into foam in the original fairy tale. Found a ways around that one though.
I feel like this wouldn't. Well, I feel like the red shoe wouldn't really have any point if you like it doesn't get to that point. I guess you could go through. I feel like it's a hard story to tell to a bunch of kids because it feels like the allegory would be addiction and obsession. And it's just like I feel like that's something that like little kids aren't gonna understand and grasp. But like that's what's so fascinating about this is this film, as you get towards the end of the film, becomes the fantasy because
Yes.
throughout the whole rest of most of the film, you just see this as this is a woman stuck in between two strong forces of like, I love this man who is Marius Goring's Julian is the composer, right? So like she actually loves this man. Will she run away with him and put this whole entire life behind her? And there is a middle ground here. Like she could still have a career and and still also be in love with this man, which I think that's also an interesting commentary. Like this film being from 1948 is really about two men trying to force their perspective on this woman and being like, no, you can't have this career, just love me. And this other one, Anton Walbrook's Boris, is just like, you can't have anything else in your life, dance is your life. And which is even interesting, like I don't know how many of you watched Challengers this year.
I did. Good movie.
This had I feel like this has Challengers has some layers to this kind of dynamic. This one's a lot less horny than Challengers, but this also wasn't directed by Luca Guadagnino, so that's understandable. But the idea of and I think this really goes back to your point, Jim, about how much agency does she have? Because she is in a position where she's being torn between these two men who are really forcefully trying to, like, hey, you need to give this all up so we could love each other. It's like, you could love each other and still her be able to dance. And this other, like, no, you can't have love. Your love is dance, which I feel like that is such a big theme in so many famous films of anything about somebody who's become so obsessive with their profession and their work and they're running themselves to death. It's like the story of somebody who died 2 days after they retired because they just ran themselves ragged. This literally just goes there. But Jim, what were you going to say?
I was going to say that you touched on part of what I found so frustrating.
Mhm.
There were a couple places in the film where a dialogue should have happened, and it just didn't. Like, for example, sorry, Moira, what was that? What was the ballerina's name?
Vicky,
Victoria.
Victoria.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Vicky, that's right. She decides to, instead of, it took me a second to put this together, by the way. Instead of going to the opening night of her husband's opera, her partner's opera,
Mhm.
Right.
she is kind of seduced back into the ballet by Boris,
Mhm.
because she knows she's going to be like the show. She's the star of the show, right?
Mhm.
But she never told him and they never talked about it. And then the three of them are all in a scene together and she's telling him, I didn't leave you. And then he doesn't respond, but Boris charges in instead. And there's like no conversation. They don't connect at all. And I was just like ready to throw things at the screen, you know? But I think it does speak to the time. And there was a lot of implied kind of the fact that she was going off with him, I guess, in 1948 would imply that she was going to be a mother to his kids and not have a career of her own, I guess. But Craster did say that. He's like, you could dance anywhere. Like, why do you have to dance with him? Which is also a very good question. And it really frustrated me that they never talked about like the cruxes of conflicts were never discussed to be resolved, Joe?
I definitely agree with you because there's definitely a lot of implication to it. The way I look at it is that the composer is kind of taking advantage of himself. Even at the start of the movie, where his piece was copied by another composer, so he was always trying to reach that. He only got his start because of Boris. So underneath it all, Boris is like, you can dance with anybody, but like, I made him too, and he's not really appreciative of that. That's at least what I took out of that, is that it's just pettiness. Like, let's just be real, it's just pettiness.
I'm glad you pointed that out. I was going to bring that up too. But also, I would like to point out that, like Jim was saying, there's just, there's a lot of expectations without people having real conversations about it. The
Right.
implications at the time, I guess it's kind of hard to look at through a modern lens sometimes. But like, for example, he simply won't let her go do what she wants to do for her career. And, I get that he might not want her to be dancing for that guy explicitly, but like Jim said, no one ever had a conversation about it, so it becomes this whole big mess.
And if you are looking for horniness, it's there.
This is not
It is.
as explicitly horny as its challengers, but I get your point. There's definitely there's a lot of tension about this, and also, like, if you really look into it, dance is an expression of emotion and feeling. And obviously, like, through the lens of like, this is a ballet, this is this, it's I feel like there's a lot of toxicity and manipulation that's going on in this film. And in many ways, I do kind of feel like Victoria's a bit of a blank slate to it all. And I feel like it's more of, this is a fairy tale. So if you think about like a lot of fairy tales, it's like you have like the princess or the main female lead being drawn by temptation. And I feel like that's what a lot of this film is, because Boris himself, I think Boris specifically represents this temptation of fame. Because, like, I don't know how much this film really like aims at the fact that like it's not a romance, it's not a love between him and her. It's his vision of like, wow, she could be the biggest thing in the world and I can make her that. There's
Right.
an arrogance, there's an obsession with that. And I feel like Boris in many ways is the power of the red shoes, and she can't get away from it. And that's the tragedy of the story, is that she literally can't get away from it. And I feel like you don't fully realize that until like the last scene, where there legitimately is like a drawing of that force and pushes her to do something very drastic and also very dramatic and very cinematic and so impactful. The final sequence of this film, and then that bastard Boris, what he does in response is such a cheap thing at the end. It's just like, it's what she would have wanted. It's just like, oh, sure it was.
I love
But
his
you
line
know,
delivery during that scene where
Yeah.
he's addressing the audience.
mhm.
It's interesting you say that two shows to chain, because it kind of reminds me how, kind of like really random, but I feel like it kind of relates. The movie Ed Wood, where Ed Wood only relates to people through movies and like references, like the scene where Bela Lugosi dies, he's watching his performance, whereas Boris is so consumed with the ballet and the actual process and the art of it that he can't get himself out of that, you know, like he's just stuck into that world. I also got to say, as far as physical pain goes, like him punching the mirror and Vicky falling onto the train, people have some superpowers in this world because obviously they don't get as affected as most people do when they get hit by trains or punching mirrors. But I digress.
You had to have the dramatic moment after the train incident, Joe.
I'm glad she was still put together, not in multiple pieces. You know.
Remember, this
She
is
hit
still
the top of the
1948.
train and flew off. It was quite
She bounced
ragdoll.
off.
They just didn't show it.
Point taken. That
Well,
was
remember,
definitely for dramatic effects.
remember, it's a fairy tale. People
Yeah.
can get run over by trains and still have enough energy in them to have dying words.
It wouldn't have worked if there weren't. Then it's I think it's that classic idea that like, did that make sense? Did it make the movie better?
Right, yeah.
And it doesn't matter. And
It's
I think
suspense,
Yeah,
that's
suspense,
no, of
suspense of
course.
disbelief, 100%.
well, no,
I'm
I was
just joking.
thinking maybe this is a wrong interpretation, but I was wondering for a minute when that scene came on where she has her last words, if this is just if we're just in her head and this isn't something that actually happened, it's just maybe her dying thought. I don't know.
we'll never know.
I
But
mean,
we
so much of the rest of the movie is interpretive, so I'm not sure. I'm left not really knowing.
I think you could interpret it that way for sure. I think at the end of the day, it is a fairy tale, and I think, like for dramatic effect, we needed to hear those final
Yeah,
lines and
right,
stuff like
right.
that.
Right,
But
yeah.
no, she did look pretty darn good for getting run over by a train, and also the fall, because like that wasn't like a short distance either. Um, as I'm sitting here just watching professional wrestling the night before, watching people throw themselves off of steel cages and stuff like that. But like, you
Seeing her
know,
run up those stairs too, man. The speed of it all. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
again, looks great.
mhm.
Practicality, absolutely not, but looks fantastic.
Absolutely.
Well, and just that whole sequence, how it was directed, like the where she comes up
Yeah.
and like slowly stutter steps back, and you're like, oh no, and like it cuts to her feet, and you're like, oh no, and she does the run, and she starts running away, and it's just like, oh no, this is gonna end badly. And it's a very powerful moment because like how it's framed and how it's edited, and that's one of the things I love most about Powell and Pressburger is they really do know how to make a film come to life.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a lot of complexities to the human dynamics in this, and there's definitely some bad communication between these people. But in terms of what they each represent is so fascinating and compelling. And I think like none of these three actors are like household names. Like nobody's gonna be like, you know who's my favorite actor? Anton Walbrook. You know, he was so darn good in the red shoes. People are like, who? But they each play their roles so perfectly. Like Marius Goring, I feel like has popped up in a decent amount of other things. I know he's in some other Powell and Pressburger films. I don't know if Moira Shearer really did much. Well, she also popped up in other Powell and Pressburger films. But
Speaking of household names, like Moira Shearer, like there were times where I kept thinking to myself, she looks a lot like Vivian Lee.
I kept thinking I saw Anton Walbrook in something else, but I couldn't place him at all. And then I looked him up and I hadn't seen him in anything. He just had one of those faces, I guess.
oh, he was in Gaslight. I love that movie. Great movie. Also, you know, where gaslighting comes from. Um
It's kind of
fascinating.
funny too. That's Boris's actor, right? It's very
Yeah.
appropriate that he's in a movie called Gaslight.
There's some gaslighting going on. It's just like there's a lot of manipulation in this movie. And I think what's so tragic about it and why Vicky's such a tragic character is that there's so much pulling her in different directions. And I could definitely see where you're coming from, Jim, where the frustration sets in because it's just like nothing, like it's all like her being manipulated, her being drawn in this way, and it's just like, look, I'm gonna get away. And then literally she finally makes a decision, and then those shoes are like, not today.
She did
And
want it though, right? Like, something I wanted to talk about was something that came back in the dialogue a couple times. One, they kept talking about how she didn't want to live, she wanted to dance, which I guess can be profound when you think about how the movie ends.
Mhm.
But to me, that's like, I didn't realize that means I want to be famous. I thought that just means I want to dance, which sounds
Yeah.
very innocent. And then they kept saying this other thing, the only thing that matters is the music, or only the music matters. I was like, what does that mean? Does that mean the dance doesn't, the ballet doesn't matter? Like,
I took it as more like
I don't know
the
what they were
people
trying to say
who
there.
interpret it don't matter as much.
I I feel like a lot of these characters have very toxic relationships with their passions. Because like Boris's whole identity is this. Like to the point where it's like he has this gorgeous woman in front of him and he has no interest. Like it's so focused and specific that it's about the dance. And he projects that, I feel like, on Victoria of like this could be all. And I feel like that's the struggle too, because like at the end of the day, what does Victoria really want? She wants to be able to dance. And I don't know if it was supposed to be this way, but I just got the vibe that like if she went with Julian, like she's giving up something. And whether that's what Julian is putting across, or if that's what Boris is putting across, or if it's the red shoes that's putting this in her head that like, and that's a challenging thing too, because this is fantastical. And it's like, what's that idea putting in her head that like without I know Boris is definitely putting her head without this, without me, without this ballet, you'll be nothing, you won't be a dancer anymore, which is extremely manipulative. It just there's a lot of challenging things going on in this film in terms of where the characters' motivations are coming from and what's drawing them in different directions. But Joe, what were you going to say?
I think that leads me to my next question for everybody because, and it kind of came up earlier, but Boris deciding to still play the Red Shoes Ballet without her. What are your guys' thoughts? And I'll share mine after.
I I I think that what to go off what Shane said about how like the ballet and like the ballet company is basically his whole identity. So like for me, like him deciding to go on without Victoria, that was like as much as he wanted to have her in his company, that was his way of saying that was his way of saying, um you know, although I could have made something great out of you, I can like I can easily find another talented dancer. I'm gonna be fine. Look, I'm gonna be fine. I can keep this company going. I can easily find someone else to mold.
Yeah, like it was very much he could if he could have found her corpse and had marionettes, he probably would have done that because to him it's about making the show. It's about and it's very effed up because it does have like this context of most filmmaking or like most studios where you have producers that are just like, let's just make content, let's just make stuff, And then
it's the very
that's just the way things go. That's the zeitgeist.
yeah, like,
The show
it's
must go on
The
mentality.
show must go
yeah.
on.
Yeah, it
God,
did feel very much like he was capitalizing on her success to make sure he didn't lose that opportunity to keep doing that show.
Yeah.
so how crazy would it be if somebody went and did like an edit of like the events of the film and tacked it on at the end to Queen's The Show Must Go On? It would hit.
Oh,
But
I
like,
was waiting for the red shoes to like lace themselves up around invisible legs and go dancing off into the ballet. I wonder if they could have found a way to do that, if they would have. Um, yeah, I don't know. I felt like it was not the most. It didn't give a lot of closure, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, to the end of the film. But like you said, the show must go on. The troop's still there. Boris is still Borising.
yep, he'll find somebody and some other woman's gonna lace up those red shoes.
And he's going to find some other young composer who's got a brilliant ballet or an opera, and he's going to take that.
And will he ever learn anything? Probably not, because that's
Well,
obsession.
well, and I think the point at the end of the red shoes, like the story why it's so dark, is that it's a cautionary tale. And the only two people that are hurt at the end of this movie are the ones who are earnestly in love with each other. Because like she dies and Julian's in pain watching the love of his life die, and Boris just moves on. And it's a sad, dark representation of what this business, any business, will do to you. Because like I think this for any of us on this call or listening at home who spend way more hours doing their job than they really need to because they're passionate about it, this is a cautionary tale of they will move on without you. You'll be dead and beaten down and ground into the earth, but show must go on. And
happy
that's what
Thanksgiving.
happy Thanksgiving. I do think that this is like a really dark ending of this happens to people all the time. People are manipulated for their passions, ground into the earth by the machine, and the machine keeps going. Boris is that machine. He is the one, he is the embodiment of like ballet is an art, film is an art, but there's always the mechanisms that keep it going and keep it moving forward, despite the fact that it might have cost some people their lives, their livelihoods, and their happiness along the way. And they all did it in hopes that they could live out their dream. Like, how many people has Hollywood chewed up and spit out? And I feel like this film is a very big indictment of that. And it's just it's a cold ending to a beautiful, it's such a beautiful film, and then it's so dark underneath and so disgusting, because if you strip away all the visuals of this is just a whole bunch of toxic human connections and interactions. And it's so fascinating, like that dichotomy, because it's like, wow, that movie was so beautiful, but damn, I'm depressed. That's the feeling at the end. They should have put that on the poster.
I wonder if they ever considered doing the real life scenes in black and white at the beginning, maybe, and then the ballet being all in Technicolor. It would have made the contrast of that life as a star a little bit more stark, but I guess life as a star was also happening outside of the ballet. Like they're all wearing nice clothes, they're hanging out in Monte Carlo and on the French Riviera, I assume, and these beautiful European locations. So like I think Joe said at the beginning, fantasy and reality kind of start to mingle. But But again, if this is like 48, like post-war England,
Yep.
that's not a realistic picture of how people were living their lives at that time, you
That's a
know?
good point.
Well, and what's
Yeah, it's a
interesting,
subsect of people.
it's interesting context too, because Powell and Pressburger were able to have a career of substance because they made films for the British film movement during World War II. So, like, they were home making films for people and trying to, like, encourage people and get them to believe in something and distract them. Like, they made, I can't wait to check out The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. That was one from that documentary that really stood out to me. They did A Canterbury Tale during the war, and I know where I'm going. And like all these films, they were basically paid by the British government to make these films to distract people during the war. And then after they had their three biggest, most iconic films that came out were A Matter of Life and Death, which is also called Stairway to Heaven, Black
Huh.
Narcissus, and then The Red Shoes in 3 straight years. And they never really reached that height again. Um, and this is probably not going to surprise any of you, but they had a lot of challenges with studios and creative control. If you couldn't tell that, like, they're very artful, very like specific kind of filmmakers, and it's always the struggle of getting the money and stuff like that. But it's very interesting that like they spent all the war trying to distract people, and then after the war they came out with these like big, vibrant, beautiful, fantastical kinds of films, especially this and A Matter of Life and Death, because A Matter of Life and Death is about a pilot who is accidentally like left behind because he's supposed to die in a plane crash. There's no way that he should survive it, but an angel forgets to take him. And then he falls in love with this woman. And then he has to go on a trial for his life to try to earn heaven's approval to stay on earth, to be with the woman that he loves. And it's just like they make some very interesting, fantastical films, which are also all of them are gorgeous, like absolutely gorgeous. But this is a very interesting film to be like throwing out there post World War II, because I feel like a lot of people probably needed something fun and light to watch. This ain't it. Black Narcissus is not either. If you get around to checking that out as well, that's about temptation and lust within a nunnery in like the Himalayas. Because Christian missions and all that fun stuff. So, but is there anything else anybody else wanted to bring up about the Red Shoes?
While we're on an aside, the Black Narcissus I'm aware of is a Brazilian film from the 70s. Do you know if it was a remake or if it's completely unrelated?
I'm gonna look into it.
What was it about?
It was, I remember it being also fantastical. The scene, I've never seen the whole thing. The scene that I always come back to is these kids, two or three kids, and a guitar, and they're talking in like very abstract, magical, realistic terms about this sunrise that they're watching. Like that's come to me probably through Instagram or something like that, and
Because
I'm always like, oh, I need to watch the rest of this movie.
their film is based off of Rumer Godin's novel, Black Narcissus, which also was made into an FX miniseries in 2020, starring Gemma Arterton, and I watched it. I It's kind of hard to compete with like the Powell and Pressburger, like the gorgeousness of it. And but it was still interesting. It is very much a story about lust and temptation, because like the a couple of nuns are very much become very much smitten with this man who winds up finding his way into their nunnery. And it's also like about like colonialism and stuff like that, and Christian missionaries and all that kinds of stuff too. But would recommend. Maybe that'll wind up on the movie club Sunday too. Anything else anybody wanted to chat about, or we feel like we're pretty good with the red shoes?
One last thing I want to throw in there, like from the start of the movie with their production companies being like this guy throwing in a giant drum. I was like, is this the movie? It's like, no, that's just the production company logo.
Just the logo.
That's crazy.
Made in England. All righty. Well, I hope you all enjoyed our conversation about the red shoes. You can find this on Max, because of course. If you want to find some awesome classic films, you watch it on Max, because they're the best streaming service, and Warner Brothers, I'll be expecting a check. But thanks from everybody, from Kevin and Joe and Jim, Vinnie, and Shane. Thank you all for tuning in. Next month, we'll be celebrating. Now it's another year, means there's another year of film that we could talk about. So we're wrapping up, starting off the new year with talking about Chef from 2014. So if you're going to watch it, make sure that you're not hungry, because it certainly will make you hungry. And then also play a drinking game. How many of Jon Favreau's famous friends can he get to show up in cameos in Chef? And we'll talk about that. But thank you all, as always, for tuning in and supporting the Development Hell podcast.